Hi, in this video of InkWhat, we discuss the chapter by Achin Chakravarti, Reforming the Labor Markets in States, Revisiting the Futility Thesis. So, through this chapter, which is presented like a perspective, the author has tried to argue that what is the degree to which the labor reforms have been effective, whether labor reforms are just catering to the labor market or or they go a step beyond than that. Step beyond would mean also affecting the output, national income, employment, and hence an inclusive development of the country or not, and especially the employment. So, is labor market reform really affecting just the labor, or it is going across states, within states, and each individual? So, as an introduction, the chapter begins with analyzing why the labor market reforms were even required. So, the first point about that is that, as you know, the history of it, ever since before 1990s, especially, India had a lot of restrictions, whether it was trade restriction or it was working in the industries, working in the manufacturing units, working in factories which had exploitative conditions to work with. Everything was highly restrictive, and that made the retrenchment of workers very difficult. Workers were not able to exercise their rights at all. Rights like simply to have a roof to live with while working, they did not have such access. Wages were quite low, working conditions were pathetic. So, hence, the need to reform the labor markets in India arose. And especially steps which have been tried in the past, like the IDA, the most important step in the history has been, especially for the states, it has been the Industrial Disputes Act. Industrial Disputes Act 1947. Other acts relevant to labor also have been there, but they have had a very little impact on the general perception of industry and business, that the labor laws are rather stringent. So, the stringency or the stringent aspect of labor laws is something which is quite pertinent, and it's not being, uh, you know, out from the frame and the image of labor market in India. This has been the complaint. There's an exception. Rajasthan's case is discussed in your chapter. So, Rajasthan case was that Rajasthan tried to amend the IDA and the Contract Labour Act 1970, Factories Act, and it received the president's assent also in November, in 14-15 November only. So, the most important change was that Rajasthan's employment went up, and it was able to say about more than the employment. Actually, the issue could be addressed, and Supreme Court could adhere to that or listen to that. The president could listen to that. So, the threshold of the number of employees required for applying the Factories Act has been increased from 10 to 20 in electricity powered factories, and from 20 to 40 in factories without power. So, such has been the role that employment could increase in Rajasthan. And these kind of initiatives, though it is in the name of enhancing the status of workforce, author still argues that such initiatives have only been able to improve a ease of doing business, or a demonstrative aspect of how workforce will improve, how labor force will improve, but at a deeper level it's not changing the scenario much. Such examples you should remember, which the author has discussed differently. It's a very, very detailed case. You should just remember that it's an exception. Even if you mention Rajasthan's 2014 attempt, it's well enough, because it shows the examiner that you know the case, you know the example, isn't it? So, states have not been acting on the amendments of these acts, but Rajasthan did, and president's nod it received. So, that matters. Then, again, the complex issue of closure of the unviable units also posed a very important factor to reform the labor markets. So, author has argued the futility argument. Now, what is futility argument? So, it is not like the rights based position, because rights based position, which is the the purpose behind others who say and profess about labor market, they say that job security is the reason, and job security being the sole reason for workers to have a better life, the government and hence the factories and manufacturing places should follow that. But the author has set the futility argument, which goes one level deeper. It says that, is the labor reform able to aim at GDP growth enhancements, also employment generation at a faster rate? So, what is the utility out of such reforms? That is the kind of hypothesis the author has. Okay. Next, after such an introduction and the context, let's just discuss about the issues in labor market. So what are the issues? In the first half only, your author from the middle starts with discussing the issues, and each issue is a well-known issue. We've had chapters on this in the past, if you can recall previous chapters. The first issue being jobless growth situation. You know that even though India's GDP growth grew, service sector came up after 1990s. Our services expanded, more than expanded, they diversified, but the jobless growth remained a pertinent situation. Employment did not grow. In fact, jobs were not, fully occupied. Then overall, there was a low labor force participation. It's been just 40% of total population in 1450. Now, why is this a issue? Okay, so this is an issue because it indicates that only 40% of total population means our demographic dividend is not getting used. Now, demographic dividend, if you remember, it is a specific portion of the population 15 to 45 years which is capable of working, the youth, and which is capable of contributing the most to GDP growth and the development of the country. So if that population is not getting employed in the respective good ideal firms or jobs, then that shows that the labor force participation is weak. From the second point only, it follows that hence there's a low female labor force participation, and the author says it's been disproportionate also. So disproportionate means that between men and women are having even lesser than men force participation, and we know the reasons, because India is still plaguing with problems like village economies are not able to promote their female very well, then they are not able to educate the girl child, and because of lack of such skills and lack of pertinent qualities, women and then the social stigma which is attached to the society, women still have female participation issues in the labor market, and that's a very 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 important point, characteristic of India's labor market issue, right? Okay, next is more than 90% of labor force belongs to informal or the unorganized sector. So basically, here comes the major problem of labor market. It's about informalization. So informalization indicates a situation in which the rules are not clear, the job is not secure, the workers are getting exploited, the skills are not appropriate to the job, they are not marked well, and the output is completely non-effective. Such a sector is informal sector, and even if our labor force is growing, more than 90% is belonging to such sector which is not generating the effective output. So that's a concern, it's an issue. Then there are rigid labor laws. Even till date, we don't have some laws changed. Workers are employed and fired at will. Now, this is something which is followed at private firms, right? Private firms exercise their own rules. They are exercising it by their own will, and which is not so correct for a country to progress. At a macro level, if you see, and obviously at a micro level, the individual sentiments are hurt, and the country is suffering from an ideal, genuine GDP growth rate. Again, employment is not happening. Employment comes and it goes. Then varying levels of underemployment. To underemployment is a situation when even if the person who is skilled and able to work is not actually working. So the work output is getting affected. The skill base is weak. The skill base is weak, and this means that employment is not bringing out the desired results. So we expect from employment what? We expect that the living standards improve, that the growth improves. So these things are not happening, and that is a situation which is creating a lot of problem for India. So then, continuing, we have other stumbling blocks also affecting the labor market. So till now we were just saying, you can imagine labor market as something like a demand for labor, supply of labor. Well, the supply in labor's case is what? It's the wage level, right? And there are literatures discussed in the middle of your chapter. Different authors, what do they feel about it? So that also could be read. Yeah. So the supply is nothing but the wage which is fixed by the firm. Fixed or flexible, positive slope. It cannot be negative slope though. So that's how the equilibrium is reached, right? Okay, that's a different digression altogether, not even discussed in the book. But yes, that's the logic. So let's move beyond the labor market. Beyond the labor market, what are the other issues? So first is this. See, in general, among the sectors we have, manufacturing is having a small share. Now, manufacturing is a sector which should ideally see labor force participation, and the sector itself is small. So that's an issue. That's a stumbling block. And there is low employment intensity of service sector. Now, what does that mean? So, employment low. Service sector is not having low employment. In fact, it is having a fabulous employment. But the intensity, which means in a particular firm, how many people are effectively working, that is weak, or that is too much to contribute to the desired level of output. So the intensity or the factor with which the output should come is weak. Okay. So what are the macroeconomic effects? So there are two specific. If we count all the issues together, it can just be summed up in two main factors. We have one as increased underemployment and second as informalization. So the effects are, there's this demand problem on economy. So what is demand problem? Demand problem is nothing but when you have the growth. See, basically demand is what? Demand for labor. Now the labor only is getting affected. So that is the demand of labor is getting affected. Then the national output, income, and hence growth is affected, because any demand accumulates to add to aggregate demand, and hence aggregate demand affects the output, income, growth. Then income at lowest end is not yielding. So when you don't have, we know the concept of the race to the bottom. Why there's always a concern across developing countries to develop the bottom? Because if the bottom has not been yielding well, then the mass consumption, Rostow's 5-stage model, if you remember, mass consumption is the last stage of ideal developed economy or economic growth. And if that is not able to develop, okay, so mass consumption demand is not able to develop, then that demand cannot rise. And hence this is not happening because the poor are not at their adequate level, or the lowest end is not yielding. And finally, the effect is that only an unorganized informal sector is growing, which creates issue of, even if it's having employment to increase, it's not leading to ideal stage of employment, it's leading to underemployment, it's not leading to a proper growth trajectory for the country. So these are the effects. A very important issue which is discussed in this chapter is about flexibility in labor reforms, the pros and the cons. So what is the logic of flexibility? You must have heard this word previously also, that labor reforms is associated with this terminology that workers should be allowed flexibility and standard of living, only then it will improve. But is it the only requirement? So the authors say, what are the theoretical arguments first? The first is, we know that how labor market comes into picture. So as we were just discussing in the previous screen, you were seeing how demand and supply determines the wages and determines the labor market. position of demand supply, wage setting curves. So past labor market activity has a role to determine the labor wage and hence the labor structure. Labor turnover costs is also very crucial. So labor reforms is required because of factors which change such markets, and these are like we are discussing those factors, okay, and these are like factors which were previously like the past labor market activity. This is something as a logic presented in 1980s and 1990s. Then labor turnover cost is something which is crucial of one of the model, IO model, the input output model, okay, and it stresses that the persistence of unemployment is shown by the positions of labor supply demand curves, and labor turnover costs plays an important role in the firm's employment decisions and enabling the insiders to gain market power in the wage setting process. Okay, because wage setting process is the final deal, right, which determines flexibility. The job security regulations also plays an important role in the model, which provides the justification for a policy of lower regulation to enhance. So this kind of brings out that why we need lower regulation for labor flexibility and labor flexibility for higher output. So this is the theoretical understanding that ऐसा होगा तो ये होगा तो ये होगा, that kind of situation. And efficiency wage hypothesis. So efficiency wage hypothesis, in a crux it says that productivity cannot come out from a wage, a numerical nominal value wage. It is the real wage. So wage which is actually factoring out the effort of the laborer, no the working hour also of the laborer. So if extra work is happening, extra pay should happen. That kind of wage is something which will help determine and enhance the labor productivity. There's a direct relation. That is the case of hypothesis. So such theoretical arguments exist, and there are other explanations also that the literatures. If you can quote authors, so one example is very nice, which is given by the author about how relation between the employers and workers will affect the wage rate, will affect the flexibility. Of course, it will affect the exploitation rate and non-exploitation rate. So those kind of arguments, right? Then what flexibility cannot achieve? Now this is a concern which Achin Chakrabarty primarily is trying to target. That see, flexibility is not the final goal. It has a cons also. The cons, why? Because there are inadequate credit and market opportunities. Not all rural economies will have the understanding, knowledge, awareness of issues, and there are opportunities also which are not available at times. Then there is bad infrastructure. Okay, to implement any possibility of better measures or better happenings cannot happen if the infrastructure is not good. Then erratic power supply. Then bureaucratic hassles. Now bureaucratic hassles is a very, very important point, because flexibility is all about how is the legal or the bureaucracy situation, right? Because if that is not free flowing or allowing, then how will flexibility come into picture? So flexibility is one aspect, but there are other aspects also which is important. And options like contract labor, they face high degree of attrition. Attrition is still happening. Even if ideas like contract labor come into picture, workers are leaving. What happens after the contract expires? Okay, workers are left jobless, then the jobless growth pursues, and the economy is still under problem. So we need a kind of managed or integrated kind of contracts rather than one time or part time. Those kind of arguments are raised by the author, and he's tried to generalize it, saying that attrition basically means that it does not make sense to develop skills through in-house training. Okay, that firms compete on quality and product innovation, have a stable workforce, whereas those that compete on price utilize a flexible workforce. So what do we need is basically a continuous productivity enhancement angle, rather than in-house training, or rather than rapid hasty treatments. We need a stable workforce, and for stability, we need to improve. We need to have the angle of improving the productivity, which will enhance the wage, income, living standards, and conditions. So finally, coming to the conclusions of this chapter, one of the most important points the author has tried to raise is that more than labor reform, education reform is required, because the problem is about mitigating the graduate unemployment. Unemployment means the jobless growth situation, right? The jobless growth situation, that even if those who are willing and able to work are not able to get work, that kind of situation is happening in India owing to its huge population, owing to its unskilled labor and informalization, unorganized sector thriving over and above the organized sector, those kind of factors. So we need an education reform more. We need people to develop their skills more, the knowledge base more. The social security of workers should be strengthened. It cannot be ignored, because labor reforms is not just about wage, one angle. It has to be about social security also. Living standards will then enhance. Child labor has not yet be banned. It's not completely banned. UP, Haryana is still following. That gives a complete, the image of India is distorted because of child labor still happening. Other countries have banned it and they are following it, but India has not been able to follow it rigorously. Then as we discussed, we need deeper real reforms, real wage to be well ensured. Every individual firm, organization, every firm should have its own wage, and every individual worker should have at least the minimum right to have bill, and the wage, of course, it's very important, but the working condition also needs to be at tandem with the working space. So such deeper reforms is required for India. Then from time again, at least till past decade or so, sincere authors have been targeting and talking about the gap between income and well-being. So we cannot say that if we are targeting income, we are getting benefits at well-being. No, that's not happening, and that's the situation with India exactly. Labor reform targets on income, that cannot achieve well-being. So we need social security measures combined with income measures, combined with wage measures. Then only GDP, employment, everything can be correct. The growth can be correct. It's a prerequisite for a better reformed labor market. So thank you. Hope you liked and found the video useful. See you soon.